Please join me in welcoming Mexican Secretary of Interior, Dr. Alejandro Poiré.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Well, thank you very much. That was a very generous and very kind introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today with you. I really want to start by thanking Google and Google Ideas for the opportunity of sharing all of this incredible brain power to think about the challenges of illicit networks worldwide, and in particular, the emphasis on Mexico. I hope I'll make a presentation that I hope is going to be useful, not just to understand where we come from, some of the things that we have done, but in particular, what is it that technology can do to accelerate the speed of the solutions that we're working on in Mexico. And I'm going to make an emphasis on some of the solutions that might have helped, some of the things that we have done, but in particular, some of the key areas of innovation that, with citizen engagement, might make a more significant difference in the short run. So, we've talked a little bit about, I know you've talked about the homicide rate in Mexico and all of the deaths and all of the killings related to drug cartels, but I want to make a very specific point about one of the causes of this violence. We need to understand that, because the more we understand that, the better able we will be located and situated to have a specific solution to it. One thing we need to keep in mind is that the violence that has increased in Mexico over the last 8 or 10 years has not only increased in our country, it has also increased all over the Americas. The average rate of the homicide has increased over the last 10 years in all of the Americas by about 60%. And we have countries like Canada. The numbers are very small here, but Canada has increased 78% its homicide rate between 2000 and 2010. Costa Rica, 78%. Panama, 113%. Not to talk about some of the weaker countries with weaker law enforcement in areas in the Caribbean. So homicide rate has been increasing in areas that are closely related to the trafficking of cocaine and other illicit drugs into the United States mostly. In particular, in Mexico, when one looks at part of the concentration of homicides over the last few years, it is very clear that it is heavily concentrated on some of the areas north of the border, in the northern part of the border, such as Tijuana and Ciudad Juárez and Tamaulipas, and in this area right here in the Pacific Coast, which is where some of the cartels are fighting for production as well as for distribution of drugs. So it is important to keep in mind that one of the key things behind violence is the fight between cartels for the distribution routes, for the capacity to control the distribution of drugs into the US market. Why is this so important? The key point that I want to make is that one of the things that kills is the profits, the competition for the profits of the distribution. Take a look at what happened over the last 2 decades in the flow of illicit drugs from basically Colombia and the northern part of South America and into North America. There was a very strong or a very significant part of the flow of drugs that still came through the Caribbean. In the last 10 years, it basically vanished. That route mostly transferred almost completely through Mexico. Nowadays, and for the last 10 or 15 years, over 90% of all of the cocaine that is going into the United States comes through Mexico. It's about 200 tons worth of cocaine flowing every year into the United States. How much is that worth? It's worth $35 billion a year at retail prices in the United States. That's a very significant market. And the key question is, what can we do to prevent or diminish the violence that is produced by the competition between cartels for these gross profits? Let me take a look a little bit at the figures, and I know you've talked about this, but I just wanted to make another point about it, of the drug business as a demand-driven business and the size of the market. The estimated annual value of some global criminal markets is not just cocaine anymore. It's also methamphetamine. The size of the global market of methamphetamine, which also travels through some of these routes, it goes into the southern part of Mexico and it goes all the way into the United States, is also worth about $80 billion a year worldwide. Also, opiates, mostly things like heroin produced from poppies, a large number as well, $65 billion. Another significant market, trafficking in persons, $32 billion, and trafficking in guns, about $1 billion a year. Why is it that the violence is concentrated in these points? Well, of course, because areas like Tijuana and Ciudad Juárez and Mazatlán and Lázaro Cárdenas and Acapulco, Nuevo Laredo, Monterrey, and some of the ports in the Gulf are also very significant and fastly growing commercial hubs in Mexico. These are areas where almost a very significant part of the legal commercial trade goes through. And those are the exact same routes that the drug routes are being using and have been used over the last several years. The key issue, the key change that has happened in Mexico that has brought about this change in the level of violence was that cartels were able to develop relatively large networks at the local level with corrupt local level police officers that allow them to challenge other cartels and try to control the flow of those drugs through those particular areas. So especially, that is why we saw the concentration at the beginning of this presentation, in particular in these areas that we are looking at. It is true that we have seen some levels of violence come down in some of these areas, but we need to do more, and we need to do it more quickly. Another point that I want to make. The increase in violence doesn't only have to do with exogenous factors, as is very obvious. It is also the fact that there's a very low cost of committing crimes in Mexico. It has to do with a number of things. I'll focus on two reasons behind it. One of them, and I think I have to address this point, it is fairly obvious and we need to keep thinking about it, is that the cost of high-powered weapons in Mexico has significantly diminished. In the year 2004, the assault weapons ban expired and was not renewed by Congress in the US or by the administration, and therefore, price of machine guns in the US has dropped significantly. It's not just the price, but also the availability for these cartels that at the very same time were growing, and we're developing larger networks, and we're beginning to fight each other for these large distribution networks. That is another reason behind the high levels of violence, because it is harder for local-level law enforcement officers to challenge some of these cartels. And that is why it has been necessary for federal forces to try to go and help local-level law enforcement to bring the levels of violence down. The cost is going down while the guns are going south. We need to think about alternative ways to work on these problems. We have confiscated 140,000 guns in the Calderón administration. Over the last 6 years, we have confiscated the number of guns that would be enough to use for at least 1.5 of all of the military forces in Central America. It's a very significant number of guns, and we need to do more. But we also need to think about other ways in which, beyond what can be done to stop the flow of weapons into Mexico, what is it that, from within, we can actually do to increase the cost of crime? We have a significant problem there. Impunity means a lower probability of being caught. And we have a significant problem with impunity in Mexico as well. According to this international comparison, the average impunity, or the higher percentage of impunity in Mexico is actually staggering. It's almost 81%. The international average is about 24%. And according to citizen polls, only 2 in every 10 crimes are actually reported to authorities in Mexico. And quite frankly, this is understandable. Only 6 years ago, when we began the administration, we faced a country where we had seen a systematic number of economic crises between the 1970s and the early 1990s. We really didn't see a large investment in law enforcement officers, in the development of a strong judiciary, and in other areas of the rule of law that were needed to confront the kind of challenge that we were going to face. So we basically, at the beginning of the Calderón administration, we developed a national security strategy that had 3 main components, and I'll talk very briefly about them. One of them, of course, was to realize and recognize that we had very significant and large cartels that were fighting for the profits of this huge drug market, and that were not only working on drug trafficking, but they had also developed and integrated horizontally into other markets, other criminal markets, such as extortion and kidnapping and robbery, and had also been corrupting very significantly local authorities, in particular in the areas that I showed. So we basically needed to bring these cartels down. But it's not just bringing the cartels down. It is essential also to do all of this institutional development, to bring the capabilities of local law enforcement officers to a completely different level, so we would have a greater opportunity of bringing justice and actually engaging the citizenry and making sure that the costs of crime would go up. And the institutional and legal transformation that needed to take place was just very, very significant. I'll give you a little piece of information about that. We also needed to make a very important program of reconstruction of the social fabric. It is especially in these areas, in some of these border towns, where the maquiladora industry grew very rapidly, and where migration levels were also very high, and where crime levels were also very high, where in particular groups like youth and women were very, very vulnerable. And so we needed to increase our social investment there. And I'm not going to talk that much about it, but it's a really remarkable transformation that has taken place in some of these areas. In terms of the containing and the weakening of criminal organizations, we have made significant strides. I'll just give you one piece of information. Out of the 37 top criminals or most wanted criminals in Mexico, 22 of them have been brought down, and we keep on working to bring these cartels down. Some people say that this is not enough. It is obviously not enough. But in order to diminish the capabilities of these organizations, you certainly need to go against the top-level leadership to try to diminish the capability and try to decrease the know-how and the networks that these organizations have that can challenge the state and that are harming the population. In terms of the institutional and legal transformation, just give some thought to this idea. Mexico is a country that has 112 million citizens, 112 million people. At the beginning of the Calderón administration, we only had 6,500 federal police officers. And we had 400,000 state and local level police officers. None of them were vetted. Their average salary was about $300 a month. We really needed to change in a radical way the kind of police force that Mexico had. Now we have over 37,000 federal police officers. Over 7,000 of them are actually college graduates, and they have a very significant technological capabilities, and they have very significant platforms to try to increase the intelligence capabilities to fight crime. But it's still only 37,000 federal police officers. So we also needed to transform state and local police forces as well. So with significant federal subsidies, we have developed a program that will ultimately guarantee that every single police officer in Mexico is properly vetted, trained, and equipped. Right now, we already have 100,000 of them, which is also a significant transformation. Of the 430,000 local-level police officers, 100,000 of them have been properly vetted and have been better trained. And we're still working very hard to improve their equipment, but it's still only 1 in every 4. And there are significant areas and significant localities where even the size of municipal police is just not enough. And they're very challenged by these groups that not only have access to these profits, they also have access to these cheap guns that are high-powered. So we need to do more, and we need to do it more quickly. In terms of reconstruction of the social fabric, we have, like I said, we have significant programs. We have developed a very large network of attention to addictions and to rehab programs. We have more than doubled the budget devoted to that. And we have, very significant social programs. I'm not going to waste your time talking more about those because I want to focus on what is it that technology can do for us today to improve the national security strategy. Well, I hope you recognize this little video. The question is there a technology that can effectively seal the border to drugs? Can be tried. And certainly, we have been investing a lot of money in non-intrusive technology to guarantee that all of the cargo, or most of the cargo that goes into Mexico, is actually monitored through some of this technology, and that our customs officers are properly trained and vetted, and that we have the systems that will not only look at the contents of some of these trucks, but that the information going from that system is actually seen by somebody else in a mirror center someplace else so that we can prevent corruption from happening at the site. But this is incredibly costly. And it also challenges our notion of free and safe and open commerce between Mexico and the United States. You know very well that Mexico and the United States share the most active border in the world. And think about what challenge it is to try to stop the flow of about 200 tons of cocaine every year into the United States. That's what the total market for cocaine is. It's about 200 tons a year. Think about it this way. 200 tons is about 10 trailers. If we think that in every single trailer we use 20 tons, it's worth about 10 trailers. The total number of trailers that travel between Mexico and the United States every year is over 4,800,000. So it's going to be hard, really hard, to try to monitor every single one of those trucks effectively. It's going to be very hard to actually seal the border to the flow of these drugs. So the profits for the trafficking of cocaine are still going to be there. So long as the demand is at a level at which it is now, and yeah, I mean, it's moved a little bit, it's waxed and waned, but it's still very robust. The market for cocaine and for other drugs that flow through Mexico is still very robust. So yes, we probably should invest more into more intelligent technologies that actually make our borders safer and more efficient. But it's not very likely that the key solution to the problem of violence is going to be there. What other ideas are there? Well, can future technology actually disappear the traffic routes? I recently saw a talk by someone quite worried, actually, about the developing use of technology by criminals. And he wondered whether eventually criminals would develop a way to decode the DNA of things like cocaine and, of course, marijuana and heroin and other drugs. And he said, well, imagine what it would mean if these drugs the DNA were decoded, and then the production of these drugs would actually develop, and it would just not be confined to a certain area in the world, but it would be easily available everywhere. Well, one of the things that has happened to the marijuana market over the last years is that it has shifted significantly in terms of its production. It used to be the case that nearly 80% of the marijuana consumed in the United States came from Mexico. Right now, at least a third of the marijuana consumed in the United States is domestically produced. And according to some estimates, it's actually over 40% or 50% in terms of the net worth of the market. What this has entailed, it may remain a public health issue, or it may remain a private consumption issue, but in terms of public safety, marijuana that is domestically produced actually alters very significantly the public safety challenge. Why? Because the trafficking route is much shorter, and the trafficking route is much less violent. So maybe technology will do something like that in illicit networks eventually, but we really cannot wait for criminals to start developing that kind of technology. We need to do more. What is it that we can do today? What is it that I challenge you to think about today? Well, what can technology do now to reduce impunity and increase citizen engagement? There is good news about Mexico in that regard. 95 million people in Mexico hold a thing like this. There are 95 million active cell phones in Mexico today, in a country of 112 million people. That is a very, very, very large network. And these are powerful tools. These are tools that can help us get information, obtain it through images, or at least through an application that could actually determine whether a crime has been committed. And it could be sent directly to an emergency or a call center in any city in Mexico that actually has it. And we actually have it for a large portion of the country and almost everywhere where most of the crimes that are being committed worry us the most. What if we could develop a system that used this technology and actually went not just to the people in the call center, but to citizen watchdogs that would allow us and help us to monitor the people in the call center? Yes, indeed, I just told you, 1 in every 4 police agents in Mexico is vetted, which means that 3 in every 4 is still not vetted and is probably corrupt, or at least subject to significant pressures from criminal organizations and criminal networks. What can we do to help not just the citizens that are aware of a crime that is being committed, but also those law-abiding police officers that actually want to do their jobs? We could probably produce simple, practical, very basic software that would allow us to improve our capabilities of reporting crimes to police and also making sure that citizen networks could monitor that this information is actually used according to proper procedures, that there is no misuse of this information, that when you call 911 or when you press your little thing here and actually send the report, that report is anonymous, so that people will not necessarily target you back if you're saying something about what you're seeing. Not only anonymous, but also it is properly delivered to the call center in this particular city. And that the information that is used in that call center goes to the officer in the location, and that the officer in the location actually does the proper report. And what if we could have citizen watchdogs monitoring this information, probably in real time, but even if it's not in real time, every week or every 2 weeks. And yes, we need to have a trustworthy partner in the law enforcement community that will actually take charge of that information and fire or conduct an investigation against anyone who would be misusing that information. That is the kind of thing that we might need to think about in order to improve citizen engagement. If we were able to do that, if we were able to develop 95 million mobile phones in Mexico, and 95 million people would probably increase their level of engagement and increase their capability to talk and to say something about what they're seeing. The Department of Homeland Security in the United States has this very catchy phrase when thinking about challenges to domestic security and homeland security. They say that if you see something, you should say something. And that is, of course, based in the notion that people will use the phone and will call, and that information will be properly used. Well, in Mexico, the reason behind the high level of impunity, of course, is that people know that on the other side of the line, it is not very clear whether it's a trustworthy policeman that is going to be taking the call. But if we develop these anonymous networks, and if these anonymous networks go to the emergency call centers, and if we can have citizen watchdogs in a mirror system that will look at the way in which this information is actually developed and used, maybe we will rise, the levels of reports to the police will rise, and maybe the capability of police officers will increase significantly. And of course, this cannot be done nationwide immediately, but it can be done at the local level if we have the partnership of both a citizen group and the leaders of the law enforcement community, and of course, the technology that is needed to do it. But just think about it. Instead of I already have the slogan, but sadly it's in English. Instead of if you see something, say something, we would be doing something like, if you see something, sell something. We would be using your cell phone to try to provide this kind of information. Now, that is a specific challenge that I want to bring to this community. I am going to be in my current job for the next 4 months and 10 days. But I challenge you, if you develop this software, I will find the local level officers, the mayors, and the police forces that will implement the pilot according to something like this. And we will have the citizen partners to do it. And we will be reporting at this next conference, or by any means that Jared or someone else decides to do, what the outcomes in terms of citizen reports and impunity are. We need to develop this, and we need to do it as quickly as possible. The key issue behind this idea, the key issue, I think, behind all of this conference, and the key issue behind public safety is that it has to be public. And in order to make sure that it is actually public, citizens need to have the very basic tools to protect them from the abuses of the intermediary, but also from the abuses of the criminals. And this is the kind of opportunity, and this is the kind of idea that might make a very significant difference in the short run. Yes, I don't have that much time in my present job, but I'm sure that technology can move much, much faster than that. Well, that's basically all that I have to say. Of course, I didn't cover the whole phenomenon. There are other areas where technology might be helpful. But I just wanted to emphasize one very basic point. It is the trafficking routes. It is the very high profits from those trafficking routes that has brought about, among other things, this very significant challenge. Those things are exogenous to Mexico. And yes, we can do things to alter the costs of criminal organizations as the drugs flow through Mexican soil. But beyond doing that, we still have a very large toll upon us, which is to improve our law enforcement capabilities. And that is going to be a necessary task, regardless of what happens to the regulation of drugs, regardless of what happens to the regulation of guns, and regardless of what happens to where the drugs are being produced. In order to improve our law enforcement capabilities, we need to have the citizens actively working, and we need to have the tools to let them do their job. And we need to have the political commitment to have a true law-abiding law enforcement community. And that's what we have worked on over the last 6 years, and that's what we will continue to do until the last day of the President Calderón's administration. Thank you very much.